This week, Sam Altman, perhaps AI's biggest influencer, just sat down with a journalist and answered a really interesting question, whether or not we're in a bubble. And he said, and I quote, "My opinion is yes." In the same week that ChatGPT had a mass rebellion over users desperately wanting the drug that is ChatGPT 4o and other loved models, and Sam Altman announcing billions of dollars in spending on data centers and infrastructure over the next 10 years. Today we're going to examine this contradiction and try and answer the question of whether we think AI is really in a bubble. This is In the Loop with Jack Horton. I hope you enjoy the show. Let's start right at the top with what he actually said. Now, with the journalist and The Verge, he actually said he thinks we're in a bubble. And what he said was actually quite interesting and quite clever, because when he was asked, are we in a phase where investors as a whole are overexcited about AI? And he said his opinion is yes. And he called it insane that AI startups with, say, 3 people and an idea are getting massive valuations. And he warns that someone's going to get burnt here. And that person who loses out are going to lose a phenomenal amount of money. Now, Altman's point didn't come out of nowhere. It was just obviously days after ChatGPT's what probably could be only described as a disappointing launch, or at least the reception of that launch has been disappointing. And actually, you could argue that it's just damage control after maybe their big flagship product of the year didn't really go down as well as maybe they hoped. Now, his point in particular was that when bubbles happen, smart people start to get overexcited about, let's say, a kernel of truth, as he puts it. And if you look at most bubbles in history, most of the time, like the tech bubble, it was a real thing, and that's that kernel of truth. We know this thing is going to reshape the world. And he thinks AI might be doing the same to people. Everyone knows it's going to reshape the world, and that's that kernel of truth that people obsess over and therefore bet so big, but bet so badly. But by comparing it to the dot-com bubble, actually what he's doing is implicitly arguing that for all of the failed companies and the companies that, I guess, popped during that bubble, there are the Amazons. And those Amazons are the ones that will take the lion's share of the profits. And obviously, he's implying that OpenAI is going to be one of those Amazon companies. Now, I think a lot of this narrative, and it's been a real narrative that's emerged online in the last few days, can be boiled down to this, I guess, summary and tweet by Antonia Garcia and Nick Bauman. And the reason it's such a good explanation of, I guess, this narrative around the bubble is because of the historical analysis it makes. What basically they say is that during the Web 2 revolution, so when the internet first emerged and you had the Amazons, essentially what they say is that venture capital money from very wealthy individuals were basically going towards paid ads to pump the number of monthly active users on the platforms. And then crypto essentially used a very similar mechanism, but raising money from retail investors and people who are desperate to make some money. And what they were doing was spending money on user rewards to then try and get more people using the platform. Again, inflating usage with artificial access to cash. And AI, what these people are claiming, is actually using venture capital money like Web2 did. And what they're arguing is that in the AI industry right now, what's happening is this venture capital money being used again to subsidize compute costs. So costs to pay API providers such as OpenAI or data centers and infrastructure, which as a result inflates the number of people using it for the amount they're paying. And what they say is that eventually this is just going to blow up at some point because the venture capitalists, whether they stop putting money in, which means that nobody can afford to get usage, and because they never delivered real value, the entire industry just kind of collapses like a souffle. So in other words, every technology boom basically is being driven by external capital, by investors that subsidizes much of the costs, which helps create artificial demand that then evaporates when eventually the money runs out. And he thinks that following this playbook, that AI is just therefore in a bubble and eventually it's going to follow the exact same path. Now, if you've been following this podcast, you might guess that I don't agree with the analogies and the comparisons they're making. But I guess before I give my personal opinion, I'll go through some of the arguments and the data supporting this opinion. So TechCrunch did an investigation into the cost of these, for example, AI coding assistants are just one example, and the cost of compute, so paying for API services and all the infrastructure that sits behind everything. And so they did an investigation, and they actually found that margins on many of these products are either neutral or negative. So that means they're losing money on almost every single user interaction. And if the user always wants the best model, because why would you not, then each competing company is forced to always have the best model or the newest thing, which just costs more and more money. And when the gross margins are sometimes negative, then that screams like a big problem. And the information reported that Replit, so another big AI coding platform, its revenue and gross margins fluctuated between, or its gross margins, shall I say, fluctuated between 36% and negative 14%, which really showcases that pain of relying on third-party AI models. And for context, as a SaaS company, so a technology provider selling software as a service for a subscription or a license fee, you're looking for 80, 85, 90% gross margins. So this data makes it, I guess, easy to maybe assume or think that we must be in a bubble because clearly venture capital money is just subsidizing these big companies and they're all going to go bust eventually. Well, personally, I don't buy that. There are many, many reasons why, and I'm going to go through some of them. And one of the first ones is that this data, what it didn't reveal is actually the speed in which these companies are trying to solve these problems. Because naturally, clever, successful companies just adapt. They make something work. They've got a very good incentive to fix this problem. A great example of this is Replit. So one of the companies that I talked about just a minute ago, they actually replaced their previous pricing model to a usage-based pricing model. And that increased the gross margins to 23%. So from negative 14 to 23%. Again, still very small numbers, but big and clever companies have the incentive to figure it out. Another reason I don't buy this historical analysis is that there's just this huge infrastructure build out right now, which is extremely long term. Because the historical comparison to, say, Web 2 suggests that these external subsidies of venture capital money, for example, props up completely unsustainable usage, which completely vanishes when funding stops coming. But I don't really see that. For example, infrastructure investments look nothing like what you see in a big bubble because the scale is just unprecedented and it's long-term focused. A great example of this is Equinix, who has just secured a gigawatt of nuclear energy. These are 20-year power purchase agreements for factories that are still in development. To me, this just shows that AI is reaching such an industrial scale, it's now being treated like aluminium or steel mills in power planning. And Bloomberg just announced that US data center construction is actually on pace to now take over office building in America. So that is now more data centers being built out than there are general office buildings being built. In a world still adjusting to remote work, this slack in office construction is now being filled by server farms to basically just fuel AI. Another really big thing to me is that adoption is through the roof. So when adoption metrics are disconnected from real value creation, so Web 2's monthly active users or crypto's total value on the chain, then I'd worry about a bubble. But AI presents a different dynamic because each interaction with an AI system is representing usually some form of work being performed. So usage data just as of this month, so in August 2025, it's staggering in both scale and what it shows us about value. We're literally at a point where ChatGPT weekly users have hit 700 million, which is up from 400 million in just February. And ChatGPT is on track to have more conversations per day than all human beings combined. And even more telling is token processing, because Google announced that it's now processing 980 trillion tokens monthly, which is double the level of just 2 months earlier, which represents 104% growth in usage just in 2 months alone. Unlike previous bubbles, each token represents a specific number of words and is actually a request for AI to perform actual work or something often quite helpful, whether that's writing code or analyzing data or drafting documents. And the ChatGPT 5 backlash, to me, validates real usage and value. Users weren't suddenly abandoning ChatGPT and AI tools because they weren't happy with GPT-5. They were actually demanding online in a movement that they bring back the old models that people used to love. There are literal Reddit posts online about how people feel like they've just lost a friend because the GPT-4o model has been killed. This is the behavior of people who have integrated AI so deeply into their lives that they couldn't imagine not having this thing in their life anymore. So this bubble thesis also assumes that the subsidized costs remain super, super high, making therefore a eventual pricing correction almost inevitable. But I don't agree with that either, because what we're seeing is pricing improvements happening faster than ever. So for example, in the past year, OpenAI's GPT-4 with an 8,000 context window had cost $30 per million input tokens, and then $60 per million output tokens, whereas GPT-4 Turbo, just a year later, cost 50% less, and then 67% less than that. And ChatGPT 5 is coming in even cheaper than that. So this pricing model validates underlying demand. When Replit shifted to compute time billing, so usage-based bidding, margins immediately increased. When Cursor added usage charges to their product, customers started paying more money rather than churning. I'm not saying that this startup world is going to be easy for many of these companies in the space, but there's evidence of real value creation, not artificial demand propped up by extremely low prices. And finally, to me, this ignores a very important discussion, because many of these metrics are talking about consumer dynamics, whereas most sustainable businesses are going to be built on enterprise integration. So this survey found that integration complexity was the number one barrier to enterprise adoption, ranking even above cost. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, it's really specific to individual businesses, but it's where the recurring revenue gets built. So let's come back to where I think this could be heading. So scenario one is that we have, I guess, a small pop of the bubble within a very large build out of infrastructure. So we might see some correction of the markets over this next period. So maybe there's going to be a drop in the value people are placing on equity by maybe 30 to 50%. So you're not going to get these hugely inflated valuations really quickly, which maybe results in many startups being bought by other companies and then resulting in less venture funding going into the space potentially. But infrastructure spending will just continue because major tech companies see this as absolutely essential, no matter what the short-term sentiment is. And to track this, it'd be quite simple. We track GPU utilization rates, maybe data center construction build-outs over the world, despite the fact that stock markets might go up and down. So let's go to scenario two of what could happen, which is, I guess, a very soft landing and massive scale up. So eventually markets slowly adjust what they expect to see. Revenue growth from many of these companies starts to catch up from the amount they've spent. And gross margins for all these companies, again, start to go up, not down. In this scenario, enterprise adoption will just accelerate as integration challenges get solved. Both scenarios assume, again, that infrastructure build-out continues. And I guess the question really to me is just how bumpy the financial ride becomes. So I guess to conclude, this discussion definitely captures something real about the current AI market. Because we are seeing subsidized usage, we're seeing massive valuations and really unsustainable unit economics and gross margins for many of these companies. So the application layer absolutely shows bubble characteristics. But at the same time, there's a lot of evidence saying the absolute opposite. The immediate utility that's driving massive adoption, the infrastructure commitments spanning decades, the rapidly reducing costs of all these incredible services, and most importantly, for the success of these products, the deep psychological integration that ChatGPT really showcased. And this to me points to something that's very durable, more durable than a typical bubble. So the next 6 months are going to test these narratives, and I might turn out to be completely wrong. But if infrastructure spending maintains its current trajectory, despite these corrections that we'll probably experience, and if enterprise adoption continues to grow, and if users keep demonstrating a love and, in some very bad cases, a dependency on these AI tools, we'll know that we're witnessing a build-out disguised as a bubble. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I'll see you next week.